In this video, we're going to go over some common mistakes just with HTML, talking about HTML semantics, using the wrong tag in the wrong spots, things like that. Now, we're not going to go over why that's important, just part of your best practices and building good habits, but it helps with numerous things like screen readers, accessibility, SEO, and it's pretty easy to do. Doesn't take a lot of extra work. You just have to remember a couple of things here and there. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about H1 tags. So first and foremost, remember that the role of HTML is what? The role of HTML is to describe or mark up your text content. It is not for styling your your content. That's CSS's job. So one of the mistakes people make is sometimes they arbitrarily will use like an H1 tag just to make something bigger. And that's not at all what it's for. So it's about representing levels of section headings. So we can see here in this example, we only have one H1. There should only be one main or top level heading for any given page that you're creating. Only one H1. So that's the first thing. And then we get into our second heading, and then below that is the third, and then the fourth. And really, that's about as far as you usually need to go. Like, unless you're creating some sort of weird medical journal or something like that, or maybe a scientific paper, you probably don't need to go past maybe H and H3. Really, have one H1 at the top, a subheading, and then maybe a couple of H3. Notice what happens here. We go back to thorax, and it is back to the H3, right? So one, two, three, four, and then this is the third level heading. It's the same importance or same rank as the heading right above it, head, okay? So that's what you want to keep in mind. Only use H1 a single time. It says that right here. Avoid using multiple H1s on a page. And I mean, the rest of this gets into more styling and things like that. But remember that just because this is bigger, that's just because of the default browser styles. When you're using something like Tailwind, it resets all of that, or some sort of a normalizer, which you typically want to do for your CSS. You're not fighting various default browser styles. Okay, so go in order and only one H1. That's enough about headings. We'll close this one out. Of course, you can check out any of these things, and I'll drop the links in the descriptions here. Maybe I'll leave it open so I can put the descriptions in the link. The links in the description. There we go. BR tags. Sometimes I see learners using BR just to create space. Unfortunately, I've actually seen people teaching HTML either teach that or just not care that their learners are engaging in that behavior. So the BR produces the line break in the text. It's basically only used for a poem or an address. That's it. If you're writing a haiku or something or a poem, the breaks are actually part of the content. Remember that HTML is not for styling. HTML is about describing your content. So it is inherently a part of a poem that there are line breaks at specific spots. In an address, which we should actually take a look at that too. I'll just pull up Mozilla. The only other situation, and realistically, how often are you putting poems or no content that's poetry on a site or an application? Probably not that often. So you probably really shouldn't be using the BR tag at all. But here's one example, and I think it even tells us something like that. Well-defined purpose, create a line break. It has no dimensions or visual output. There's very little you can do to style it. You can set a margin between the lines. So somewhere in here, I forget where it is, but it says do not use, oh, here it is in the big blue call out. Do not use it to create margins. Wrap them and then use CSS margins. That's all we got to say about BR tags. Address tag. So we use this for an address because, especially for like a postal address, you typically have the name and then there's a specific line break, and the second line is supposed to be for the street address and then like an apartment number, etc. So again, in that situation, the BR is an inherent part of the address content. Use a BR there. They're not showing that as an example here, but if this was like a street address, then you would use, oh, they are doing a BR here. Whether or not you're supposed to use that here, I guess it's officially on Mozilla, so we'll take their word for it. But you definitely can use it in an address tag for like the street address, the apartments, and then city, state, zip, etc. All right, so BR tags. Again, the same general rule applies. If you're using an HTML tag to change the appearance of something, you're doing something wrong. Okay, the div tag. This is something that people just use all over the place. We create div soup unnecessarily. It is the generic container for flow content. In other words, it has no inherent meaning. The div tag is a specific generic wrapper tag that we would use for the purposes of hooking into something for CSS. The most common example might be want to make a div that's a flex box so we can get all the flex children to start lining up in one row or one column, etc. So that's when you would use a div tag right here. Like in this case, if you look at their CSS, yeah, they want to have consistent styling around this content. So this doesn't have any contextual meaning. We're throwing the div tag in to set up for CSS. Now, again, we're not using an HTML tag for styling, right? If I was to take this out and just have the div tag, then it's really pointless. There's no reason for it. I mean, then it screws up the styles. But in here, we're setting ourselves up to create a wrapper for the purposes of CSS. So again, it's a pure container. It doesn't represent anything. You use it to group content together to apply CSS. So right here, the div element should be used only when no other semantic element such as article or nav is appropriate. Actually, that's a good one to look at next. Okay, so you have div. Before we look at the nav, we'll look at span. Span is the same thing as a div. It has no semantic meaning. What's the difference? Div is considered to be a block level element, meaning it's meant to take up all of the available space, whereas span, it's meant to kind of sit in line next to its ancestors. It's a generic inline container, but the same sort of stuff applies. So in this case, you're using it because you don't want the word basal to be its own block level element. You just want to kind of mix it into your p tag. So again, this serves absolutely no purpose besides giving a setup to apply some special CSS. So in other words, you really shouldn't use div or span except to group or add special isolated styling to things. So it is for CSS. It's used to set up for CSS, but it's not actually using HTML for any sort of styling. So let's talk about the nav element because if you're creating nav, stands for navigation. So it is used for usually just one part of the page. It's the section with the main navigation links for the site. So it's not used for like secondary links and things like that. Let's see, it's not necessary for all the links to be in a nav. For instance, a footer, the little links at the bottom of a page, you typically won't put a nav element in. But you can have several nav elements, but I don't know, most of the time, from my experience, it's usually just one on the top for your main navigation bar. So instead of using a div, you put that in a nav. And then you can, apply your CSS or whatever you need to do that they do at this like an ordered list because typically you'll have a nav with an unordered list, but got this in an ordered list. They're not really going into why. I would assume that the order is part of the content. Like, yeah, it needs to go exactly bikes, BMX, jump bike. Yeah, it's presenting kind of. I don't know. I'm not going to try to guess too much. But I was a little surprised to see OL instead of UL. So usually nav would have a UL in it. But each point is use nav instead of div. More often than div, what you want is a section. A section typically, but not always, is going to be a wrapper for a second level heading along with whatever content like paragraphs are below it. So usage section, it's also generic. It's a generic section element but only be used if there isn't a more specific element. So it's still better to use this than the div. But if you just want to group stuff together, let's see, if you're only using it, this is good, use a div wrapper. Oh, here's another tag. Man, I'm adding more to the list here. Yeah, I've got article and aside. Main is pretty good. But let's see here. It talks about section. A navigation should be a nav. We'll get into what these means, but a complete like syndicated blog post. In other words, something that if you copy it off of the page and put it somewhere else on a totally different site, it would still make sense. In other words, it's a completely self-contained article, hence you would use an article tag. If it's like tangential information, related links about the author, stuff like that, you would use an aside. If it's the main content of the document, you'd use a main. In other words, there's so many tags that you should be using aside from div. So think twice besides div. So div purely for styling, you should use the div, and so the section is right along the same lines as the div, except it typically makes sense to have a second level heading. It should be identified typically with a heading. So if you're making a wrapper group and it's something that has a heading in it, you probably want that to be a section. If it's any of these other cases that are mentioned here, main, article, aside, etc., nav, use those tags. And if it's just purely for some styling, then you can use a div. And that's what they show here, where they're replacing. If you have a div with a level 2 heading, replace that with a section. All right, so there's that main tag. We kind of already said that. Typically, so it's the dominant content of the body. If you think of a typical HTML page, you might have a header tag. Speaking of which, we should probably call attention to that one too. So let's do Mozilla header. And while we're at it, let's do not HT, the header element. And while we're at it, let's do Mozilla footer. See all of these other semantic tags out there in lieu of a div tag. Now you can see why we really shouldn't use div tags very much at all. There's always something better, almost always. So we typically have a header, a main, and then, well, they don't have a footer, but you would have a footer. And that's a pretty common layout. You might have a header, you might have a nav, probably have a nav. The nav might be inside the header, depending on what you're doing. Then you'll have a main, maybe with some sections or whatever it is, and then you'll have a footer. Have more than one main element unless you're doing some stuff with the hidden attribute. We won't get into that. It should be unique to the document. If it's repeated across documents, sidebars, navigation, etc., it shouldn't be included unless the search form is the main function of the page. So yeah, just main is just main. It's the main part of your page. We've kind of already looked at header, but let's take a look at that. The header element, yeah, I mean, it's the header. Like usually you might put like your main image in here. If you look at their CSS, they're using a background image for the decoration. And then they have like the logo link or whatever, that type of stuff. So that's what you would have in the footer. Sometimes you might have the nav in there. But check this out. Header, you can repeat multiple times, right? Because this is the header, but the H1 is actually in the article. And check this out. If we took this article and just copied and pasted it anywhere else, it would be a self-contained blog post that you could share by itself. They don't have to be on this particular site for it to make sense. So that's the use of an article tag. So headers, you can have multiple headers in here. Typically, if you have an H1 and then maybe you have your H2, you might wrap it in a header, or in this case, the main heading for the article, and then the timestamp for it. You can wrap that in a header. Let's take a look at footer right next to that. All right, so there's the footer. It's, again, this is a situation where you can have a footer in multiple parts. Like, for instance, think of a bunch of product cards on an e-commerce site. Each one of them might have a little footer in it for some reason. Each one of them might have a little header in it. Each one of those cards might be a section with its own header and its own footer. So in this case, we have the article, and this has its footer, but you can have multiple footers across the page. So it's usually part of any sort of sectioning element. Let's see, enclosed in front of the author in the footer, sure. So yeah, there's not much to say about it. It's just kind of like wraps the stuff at the bottom. I would say you really don't need a footer for this part, but they may have it in there for the, yeah, they have it in there to kind of add that. It's basically like a div, but they're using a footer instead of a div because it's a footer and not just a generic. But in this case, they're pretty much using it for purposes or to set up the styling. So aside, we've kind of already mentioned, like right here is an aside. So we can paragraph a bunch of paragraphs for like the main. You might have this wrapped in a main or article, and then you might have an aside thrown in the middle of it. I don't use that too much, but if you're writing like blog posts and stuff, you might have that type of a feature on there. Okay, let's talk about styling. We don't use HTML tags to style things, okay? It's used to draw the reader's attention to contents which are not otherwise granted. You should not use B for styling text, things like that. So, offered by the school or chemistry. Again, if you're going to use that B tag, don't use it just because you want it to be bold. That's not the use case for it. You should use the font weight CSS. It is a little bit confusing. I typically go with the strong tag because it's saying it's used to draw the reader's attention to the element's contents that are not otherwise granted special importance. If you wish to indicate an element is of importance. So it sounds like it's kind of the same thing. So I don't have to use the B, I use the strong tag. So it's pretty much the same thing. Have strong importance, seriousness, or urgency. Never feed him after midnight. The strong B versus strong. Here we go. It is often confusing why there's so many ways to express the same thing. Should I use B or do they both do the same thing? The strong element is for content that is of greater importance, while it's used to draw attention to text without indicating that it's more important. So it's valid and semantic, and it's a coincidence that they both have the same default styling. And then you have tag in here. So I usually either use am or strong. Majority of the time, I've just been using strong because that's like the most modern way to do it. I never really use B. So you can take this for whatever you think it means. When I read that sentence, I don't understand the difference. It's of greater importance, but it's used to draw attention without indicating it's more important. But to draw attention, wouldn't that be more about CSS? So if anybody has any other ideas on it, anybody that writes these specifications, or if you happen to be watching this, I'd love to know more about that. But I'm just going to use strong. Is that while HTML4, which we don't even go by any version numbers, it's just HTML now, as representing strong importance. Am is used to change the meaning of a sentence with spoken emphasis. I love carrots. And it's used to give portions. I don't know. Like, this is where it gets really weird. I just use the strong and pretty much call it a day. So that you're kind of on your own. Already talked about it. It needs to be something that you can essentially place in any other site, like syndicated content, and it still has its inherent meaning. All right, we're about EM. We talked about this. Emphasis is for words that have stressed emphasis compared to surrounding text, but is limited to words of a sentence that affects the meaning of the sentence itself. So again, the same argument. I'm gonna say that they just like screwed up and they didn't send each other memos and they just ended up creating all these extra tags. I don't know. Probably should just deprecate some of these tags. So you're kind of on your own with strong EM, B, and I. Just remember, you're not supposed to use any of these things purely for styling because styling is coincidental. The browser has some default stylings, but most of the time when you're doing CSS, you're going to use a normalizer, which strips out all the default styling for all the browsers. All right, so to summarize, HTML is to mark up the content. CSS is for styling. Use only one H1. Be wary of the other headings and use them in order as needed. Don't use BR tags for styling. There's so many things you should be using instead of div in a lot of cases. Address, nav, you can even use section, article, aside, header, footer. So think twice before using div and just roll the dice when it comes to BR, EM, strong, and whatever else. Okay, so at least I hope the beginning of that helped.